This afternoon, I am in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law, the Middle Law Library, talking with Merle J. Slyhoff, who is the Collection Development and Resource Sharing Librarian here at the Law Library. Merle and I go back a long ways, as we know. We've both been active in the association pretty much in the same years. You have done more things, I think, than I have, though, in getting ready for this conversation. I do some homework so I don't look like a complete idiot asking questions and asking things that show that. And I was very impressed with, on the AELL site, there's a list of leadership roles that various people have fulfilled. And yours goes on longer in terms of number as well as significance than almost any I've ever seen. I hadn't realized you've done so much. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But before we do, Merle, could we talk or discuss a little bit, as is our custom, a little bit about your life when you were young and even today?
Sure. I'm a Jersey girl, born and raised in Camden, New Jersey, which is right over the bridge from where we are now. I have an older sister, and my parents and my sister and I grew up in Camden, and it was back in what I like to think of as the good old days when my aunt and uncle and cousins lived right next door, and around the corner my grandparents and another aunt and uncle and cousins. So it was a nice close-knit family. And I just remember a happy childhood of lots of little road trips and day trips and things like that. Now I live in Glenside, Pennsylvania, which is, I guess, considered a suburb of Philly. It's about half an hour outside the city. I have a 29-year-old son. I had him when I was 3 years old, if anybody's doing any math. And
you mean you're not still lying to him and saying you're only 21?
No. He actually thinks, at one time he asked how old I was, and I told him that I was 12. He was maybe 7, so 12 was a lot older to him. And he really did think I was 12.
So you got away with it?
I got away with it for many years. He thought my husband was 99, but that's another story. And he is a chef at a restaurant here in West Philly. So very happy about that, very proud of him.
Oh, that sounds very fascinating. 29 years old.
Yes.
He's all civilized and all grown up.
Well, civilized, I won't say all grown up. He still calls on Mom for a lot of things.
Well, that's
all
right.
That's all right. If he didn't,
what moms are for.
Exactly. If he didn't call on me now and then, I'd be upset.
You certainly would be, I suspect.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, in addition to growing up and now having a son who's a chef nearby, you also moved across I guess it's the Delaware River that is between Camden, which is another, I don't know if they call themselves a suburb of Philadelphia or an adjacent city.
Well, Mad Magazine, many, many years ago, and I have no idea why they had this, but there used to be a page in Mad where they would have just little snippet things. And they actually had Camden, New Jersey on this page. And they said its only purpose in life was to hold down the other side of the bridge that goes to Philadelphia. So I don't know if I guess it's considered a suburb.
Well, whatever it is, I know they also have a law school over
there.
They do. At Rutgers, Camden. And many, many years ago, I interviewed there for a position, which I didn't accept, but I was elsewhere at the time and wanted to stay where I was, I guess. But I remember it was very close to that bridge.
It's right next to the bridge. That's where I did my undergraduate work.
Good. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about your education and training? I know you have a couple of degrees. Could you tell us about those and perhaps where you earned them?
Sure. When I said I was Camden born and raised, I really was, because I went to Rutgers University, the Camden campus, which, as you said, is right under the bridge, and got a BA in English, and then received at the time it was called the Drexel University School of Library and Information Science. That's not what it's called now, and I honestly cannot keep up with the name changes. It has a much more modern contemporary name. But I did get my Master of Science, Library Science from Drexel.
Good. Well, you know, many of the library science programs, like you and I went through, have certainly evolved, but worse, some of the schools that used to offer them no longer have such programs.
Exactly. But what I think is even worse is that many of them do exist, such as Drexel are doing so many of their classes as online classes.
Oh,
And maybe it's my age, but I don't know that I could do an online class. I think you miss a lot if you're not in that one-to-one with the faculty member, one-to-one with your colleagues. I hire as my interlibrary loan assistant Drexel Library School students, so they get some real experience. And I've had students who, in the course of their entire program at Drexel, have had one face-to-face class. They never even meet the students. Everything is done online. I think they're missing a lot.
well, you're probably right. Having been a traditional student in the sense that I was in a regular classroom throughout, I don't know how online would truly work. I know there's a huge movement to move to more online instruction.
Right.
And maybe some combination with online and certainly in some of the classes and that many universities have in their freshman, maybe even sophomore years, where you have a lecture hall full of hundreds
Right.
of students. Maybe that could work online, but you still need the TAs or the
Exactly.
online or
Some
something.
human contact.
Yeah. Oh, whatever. Talking about activities, outside of your work, you truly, I know we had a chat at lunch, and I know you've traveled a bit, and sometimes with some of our colleagues.
Right,
I remember years ago, my wife and I we had the annual meeting was in Seattle, and we were heading up to Victoria, British Columbia, and there's a ferry about 50 miles north of Seattle in Anacortes,
Yes.
where you catch to go over there. And we showed up, and there you and several of
And
our
my
colleagues were on the
Exactly,
same kind of
exactly.
trip, or going to
Right.
the San Juan Islands or whatever.
We were heading to Orcas Island.
Uh-huh.
It's one of the things that you get from an association like this. It's a small association, so you make lifelong friends. And there were some of us, some people may have heard of the 4Ms. It's 4 colleagues who are all associated with AALL in one way or the other. And we used to do our R&R trips after conferences.
R&R.
And water played a big part in that. We
Uh-huh.
liked to go someplace, not that we had to be on a beach someplace, but just water. So that particular year we rented a condo on Orcas Island,
Oh,
which was wonderful. And we did those trips for many, many years. And as I said, I'm still friends with that particular group of people and many other people that you meet.
well, knowing Orcas Island, our viewers probably won't, but is a marvelous island to visit. But your visit is somewhat extended at the ferry line on the way off, when you
Which
come
is
home.
wonderful.
Yeah,
That was a wonderful trip, yes.
Yeah,
that
you
whole
wait
thing.
for several ferries to come and go because they don't take reservations.
No, they don't, and you get there early and you pull your car up and you sit there and you hope you get on the next one.
Well, I know you have other passions and
Right.
pursuits and hobbies. Would you like to talk a little bit about some of those?
I guess my main passion is pottery. I picked up pottery, I guess, somewhat late in life when my son was in elementary school. He was always artistic. And he wanted to take a clay class, so we went to the local art center. He took Saturday morning classes. I would hang around and wait for him, and discovered that there were adult classes. So I started taking classes and have continued ever since. So I've been doing it for about 20 years, but just within the past couple years got to the point of feeling confident enough to start doing some shows. So I've been doing shows, and I have some work in galleries. I look at it as a precursor of what I can do when I retire.
Well, I certainly am not going to discourage anyone thinking of retiring at some point when you're ready to do it. I've been retired 10 years now, and it's a nice life. My former deputy, Gary McCann at American, always used to refer to retirement as the every day is Saturday club.
That's true, except that would mean I would never get anything done.
Oh, you'd be surprised. Everyone going into retirement always says, "Well, how am I going to afford it?" Well,
That's
I
number
figure
one.
they're on their own on that.
Right.
I can't tell them. But what am I going to do with my time? And surprisingly, you wonder after a while how it was you had time to work.
I can see that happening. But
But-
I'll remember to call on you when I get ready to retire to get those fine points of how to live my life in retirement.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what it's all about. You reverse everything I say, and you'll be just fine. Well, why don't we change the subject, get off of making a fool of myself on camera, and talk about some of your work. You started off as an acquisitions assistant
Right.
at Tulane
Temple.
Law Library. Temple. I'm sorry, I'm even misreading my own notes there. And graduated actually after you graduated from college, and then while you were going to library school was during that period. As I recall, that was the era when Erwin Surensey was
Correct.
still there as director, and there had been a big fire that had destroyed the library. So you were part of, I guess, the era right after that. Could you?
No,
tell-
actually, the fire happened weeks after I started there.
Okay, so you
It
were there
was-
for the fire.
Yes, yes.
Not that one wants to be.
The original building was an old synagogue,
Uh-huh.
and the fire started in that building. Luckily, they had already started a new building, but it was still a period of time before we could move into that building, so we had to be in temporary quarters for a while.
Yeah.
But it was an experience to go through a library burning down.
I imagine not one you would want to repeat.
No, definitely not.
I
Definitely
was
not.
at the time at Yale working with a man named Arthur Charpentier, who was my immediate boss, the head of the library there. And I remember hearing from him. He was well connected with what was going on, and he told me a lot about the fire. The roof collapsing because
Right.
of the water on it from the fire hoses and stuff, and the massive destruction of a good part of the collection, I guess.
It was the collection, unlike buildings today where collections are multi-floor, this was pretty much in a large rectangle, so it was all open and the flames just spread. And it devastated pretty much the whole thing. And even though I was brand new, I was a paraprofessional, I did not have a library degree. I was fresh out of college with a degree in English and answered a blind ad to work in a library, and it turned out to be at Temple. And I had worked as a student worker in the acquisitions department at Rutgers, and this was a job in Temple Law Library's acquisitions department. And they said, well, we filled the job you applied for, but there's another job you might be interested in. So I was brand new to the profession, working as a paraprofessional in acquisitions. The job that Erwin asked me to do after the fire was to work on restoring the collection. So going through, finding out what was destroyed, what could be salvaged. It was an interesting process that I never want to have to go through again.
You know, it was interesting. Of course, I was on the easier end of this since it wasn't my library
Right.
that we were rebuilding, but I saw what sort of characterizes our profession as law librarians. I think I saw it really work. Art Charpentier made available to Temple an entire collection of the Yale Law Journal from beginning to end as our token of support to help you get reestablished after the fire.
And we had that from a number of schools. We had it from, I remember getting boxes and boxes of books from Lexis and Westlaw to replace the materials. And it really was a showing, as you're saying, of the tight-knit family of being a law librarian.
Yeah. And even a law librarian or provider of legal information in a slightly broader sense. I mean, you mentioned the companies stepped
Right.
in, and sure, they were in the business of making money, and they certainly were successful at that over the years, but they were also part of our profession in a broader sense.
Exactly.
And when push comes to shove, they, as well as our colleagues, were right there with us.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you eventually
get your library degree.
Right.
And then you came directly, I think, or pretty close here to the University of Pennsylvania, the Biddle Law
I did.
Library. Initially as acquisitions librarian.
Correct.
And now, of course, after a few years,
Many few.
you're still sort of an acquisitions librarian, but you're doing the collection development
Correct.
now.
Right.
You want to talk a little bit about your years here?
Sure.
Some of the things you've
Sure.
accomplished and.
After I got my library degree, it was Mr. Surrency, because Irwin was a very, I always referred to him as a Southern gentleman of the highest caliber. Not that I had ever met a Southern gentleman other than being in South Jersey. That was as close as I had come to going down south at that time.
Yeah, well, he moved back on real south.
He did.
He was at the
He
University
did,
of Georgia for many
absolutely.
years.
And he called me into his office one day after I was nearing the completion of my degree, library degree, and he said that unfortunately there was a job freeze at Temple, as often happens. He wasn't going to be able to offer me a position, but there was a position open at Temple, at Penn Law Library, and as their acquisitions librarian, head of the acquisitions department, and I was like, oh no, I'm not qualified for that. I'm not even going to apply. But he pretty much convinced me that I needed to apply for the job. Found out a couple of years later that he had already spoken to Dick Sloan, who was the director here, and said, I'm going to get her to apply. So, and I luckily got the job, and thinking, well, this is my first job, I'm not sure where
Be
I'll
here for a
wind
short
up,
while and move on, huh?
Right, but when you have family in the area, it's sometimes a little more difficult. And I've been here 35 years. I was at Temple for 5 years as a paraprofessional. Took me a while, part-time, to get my library degree, and I've been here 35 years. But I had the opportunity, I think a rare opportunity, I did a number of jobs here. Frank Hodek, a number of years ago, when he was editor of LLJ, did an issue where he asked people to write about their careers, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I remember going through and counting up at that time how many job titles I had, and when you actually look at it that way, you're kind of shocked, and it's grown since then. I think I've had 6 or 7 job titles here. Sometimes say it's because they couldn't figure out what to do with me. But I did start out under Dick Sloan as acquisitions librarian, which involved collection development, acquisitions, and serials, and had support staff. They used to sit and type up the old multi-part order forms and put them in an envelope and address them and mail them out. File those little pieces of paper and then process them, and we had the good old Cardex drawers. Then Liz Kelly came after Dick retired, and she reorganized the collection development unit and asked if I would start up a new department for the library and for the law school, a media department. It turned out that one of the graduating classes had given the law school and the library money to start a media department, and they were waiting for the new director to come on board to get it going. So that was my first opportunity to really start something from scratch that was related to work or the profession at all. I inherited about 12 beta tapes from the law school.
Oh, I remember those.
Oh, the good old beta
yeah.
tapes, and we limped through with our beta machine that would constantly break down, and video was out by then, so we did have video. And I started to get faculty using them almost immediately. Eventually, after we were getting ready to move into here, we were ready to equip classrooms with equipment instead of having to take and cameras. And the cameras that you're using here, I said, were about the size of a can of soup. That's not what the old cameras were. They were these big, heavy, gargantuan things. And when we needed to show things in the classroom, they were the size of the largest suitcase you can imagine of a video projector. When we moved into our new building, I was asked to help plan the new technology for the media, which of course is now all totally out of date and has been replaced. As the faculty and students started using the services of media more, I could not keep up with the technology end of it. So that went to IT. I kept the collection end of it. Liz Kelly also asked me if I would start a service for the attorneys in the area. So we started what we called Ex Libris, which was Express Library Information Service. And people would call in back in those days to an answering machine. I had part-time workers and student workers who would take the messages, we would copy what they wanted, get it to them, and bill them. We did that for a number of years, and we finally stopped because the taxes just got ridiculous. When we first started, we didn't really worry about that.
Oh, you mean the state wanted its
Yes,
share
they
of
wanted their
so-called
share,
profits?
and we were doing business by then with New York, Virginia, California. So we decided
Oh.
that so many things were available electronically that we could stop, and we were not really depriving the bar community from what we had. Attorneys can still get into the building, but we just were not providing the service to send them things.
Well, it sounds like you were serving a bar community well beyond the confines of the city of
We were.
Philadelphia.
We were. And then Liz, that then developed into Liz asking me to take over interlibrary loan. We had had a clerk, support staff person sort of running the department, and she asked me if I would oversee that person. Tragically, the person became ill and was not able to come back to work. But I never had a chance to talk to the person about interlibrary loan, so I had to learn it from the ground up, which was rather interesting. We morphed it many times. We were, some people will remember Arlen as the Research Library Information Network. We were an Arlen library.
Oh, I remember, yeah.
Right,
That
and then there was the
OCLC
Research
was
Library.
the other one,
Exactly,
yeah.
and we were not OCLC. We were primarily Arlen.
Yeah. Well, usually the costs, you were one or the other.
Well,
you were
you had
lucky
to be invited to be an Arlen library.
That's right. They were the
They were the
big
research.
the big dogs. in
Yes, they were the
game.
research libraries.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting adventure to sort of develop that, because I had no idea what I was doing. And it's morphing and changed many times since then, and it's one of those full circle things, because I'm in the process of learning their entirely new system, because they've changed it became OCLC, and all new systems are now being introduced yet again.
I think they call that progress.
They do, and it is a great system. I don't want to.
After you go through the aggravation of the process, improving, then you'll probably benefit.
Right, and then the things that you thought were so great in the old system suddenly aren't there anymore, and you're
Yeah.
not quite sure what to do. So Liz gave me opportunities to develop some new services. One other that she asked me to do that was connected to the interlibrary loan was to develop a way to get resources to our faculty that they needed. So we started, we called it faculty document delivery, and we would get things from campus libraries, from our collection, and deliver them to the faculty. For various reasons, we had to stop that service for a number of years.
No.
Then Paul George became our director, and with a new director, new adventures start all over again, and he realized that we needed to serve our faculty much more than we were. So he asked me if I could start some type of faculty service, and I said, well, we used to do this service. So
You
we
were
resurrected
prepared.
it. Absolutely. We resurrected it. We added many features. Technology had advanced by the time we started it up again. So we started that, and then when our collection development librarian retired, Paul asked me if I would take over collection development, which was going full circle for me, since that's what I did when I first started. And at that point, I gave up the faculty document delivery, and the circulation staff now does a wonderful job providing materials to our faculty. So now my primary job is collection development and resource sharing interlibrary loan. And they are two great hats to wear at the same time, because as I get a request from a faculty member to get something that we cannot provide for them at our library, and I get the opportunity immediately to say, no, I'm going to buy this for the collection. This is something that we need. I know this faculty member's interests. We're going to need this as a permanent part of the collection, or no, we can get this on interlibrary loan. Through doing interlibrary loan, I started to see how our journals were using interlibrary loan. And it was a somewhat cumbersome system because of the way they were doing it with associate editors. So I worked with the journals, and now all of our journals have research editors. And one person places ILLs. It's a great improvement over what it used to be. And then I asked Paul if I could try out being a liaison. We had liaison to faculty members, but not to student groups. So I trained the associate editors on how to use the online catalogs for source hunts, train the research editors on placing ILLs, and it's just fun being a resource for a set group of students. So I've been very lucky, like I said, to have had different positions within the same library, and I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to sort of start some things from scratch.
So you ended up with all these opportunities to change jobs, so to speak,
Exactly.
but without having to
Right.
change location.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and you've been here quite a while. You've
Yes,
worked under
yes.
a variety of people.
3 directors.
Yeah, you've talked a little bit about Liz Kelly,
Mm-hmm.
and she was a good friend to many of us,
Right.
and died quite suddenly about 2-3 years ago, as I recall.
I think it was longer than that. I want to say
Maybe.
it may have been 5-6 years ago
Maybe,
even.
maybe that far back, and I remember. Do you have any stories about her that you'd like to share? This is not something we discussed.
No,
in
no,
advance,
no,
so
but Liz was
I can clip this out if we get into trouble.
Liz was great. I mean, she followed Dick Sloan, and Dick was wonderful. I think you learn from things from every director. I always considered Erwin Surensey to be a mentor.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't have my degree, I was working on my degree, and maybe it was partly because he was the first director that I ever worked for, my first full-time position. And then Dick Sloan, everybody has their own style. Dick was very laid back. One of the things I always remember about Dick, I know you didn't ask me about Dick, but...
Oh, I'm game to, I think
For
they're all
anything.
fascinating people.
Right. One of the things, and I think to me it was just sort of something about Dick's personality in this one little thing he would do. The building did not have air conditioning. We were in the old building then. It was built 100 plus years ago. But it had these enormous windows. We would open the windows in the summertime, but it would get hot.
Yeah, let all the humidity and heat in.
Yes,
huh?
all the Philadelphia heat. And I can still see Dick wearing his blue and white seersucker suits in the summertime.
Uh-huh.
A lot of people who may watch this will have no idea what a seersucker suit is.
Times have changed.
They
with
have.
Business
They
casual,
have.
etc.
Absolutely, absolutely. But on those really hot days, Dick would come around and take orders. Who wants an ice cream soda? Who wants a milkshake? And there was an ice cream place at the food court at the time. And he would grab somebody, would go over and would get ice cream sodas and milkshakes for everybody on the staff. And that was just that sort of, fun summertime thing. We don't have classes here in the summertime, so it was a little more laid back. Then Liz came, and it was the first time I had a female as a boss, which is always a little bit different. And people said to me, "Oh, it's so great that you're going to have a woman." I thought there was no difference. But I think there is a difference. Maybe as a woman you feel there's a difference. You can talk about different things with that person. She used to sometimes just walk past my office and say, "Do you have plans for lunch?" "No." "Well, why don't you go grab a sandwich, come meet me in my office." And we would have lunch, and we would talk about our family, and she would talk about her kids, and then as she had grandchildren, we would talk about grandchildren. And it was just one of those nice, light moments that you remember with directors. And her death, because it was so sudden, was just such a shock, I think, to everyone.
Yeah. Shock for those left behind, perhaps
Right.
a mercy for her.
Right. But it was a very tragic loss to the world, because she was such. I know that family was so important to her, and they were living on the island where they had a summer home, and then I think they were going to I may be wrong. It was someplace in the Southwest where they went for the winter.
But this was summer, so they were Michigan, I think, or someplace.
Yes.
Wherever it was.
Yes, lakes. I can't remember where
Yeah,
it
they had
was.
a summer place on.
Right, one of those
on the lake.
places that
Yeah.
I believe you couldn't have a car.
Okay.
That's what I remember about it. I hope I'm correct on that.
Well, I know there are places up in the northern end where you do not
Absolutely.
have cars. The association actually, many, many years ago, held a meeting at one of those.
I was
Mackinac
not
Island.
here for that one, and I know neither were you.
Well,
but I remember reading it.
Pre-seated me, but I heard for years from the old timers of how much fun they had at this thing.
If I'm not mistaken, there is a picture in the archives somewhere of the attendees, which were maybe 25 people or something,
Yeah,
sitting around on nice, comfortable Adirondack-type chairs.
yeah. They
Probably
also
having a meeting.
Did a skit they put together about themselves, and which I guess they all thoroughly enjoyed.
I'm glad we don't have to put
Yeah.
on skits like that
Well,
anymore.
I looked it up in the proceedings in the Law Library Journal one year because I'd heard for so many years about this
Right.
sort of different meeting that they thoroughly enjoyed, and it was interesting to read. Julius Mark, who used to be the director or law librarian at New York U, was president that year.
Okay.
And knowing Julius, I could see where this might have developed that
Right.
way. And
Absolutely.
as you say, the association meetings were not as heavily attended as they are in more recent
Right.
times. And they were not as diverse in terms of the interests of people.
Right.
These were mostly people who knew each other a lot more socially than perhaps many of us are able to do today with so many colleagues
Right.
there.
And that was without the internet and Facebook and email and Twitter and all that. And I'm remembering those pictures that I've seen at the, what is it, in the exhibit hall area?
Yes.
They will often put out
Yeah, a
archival
colleague
things.
who came to the annual meetings with her camera, and she would snap pictures all over this, that, and the
Oh.
other thing. And then the next year, she'd have a display set up with a slideshow, because these were taken on slides of the old photographic variety. And if anybody wanted to order one, she would then arrange to have prints made and sent to you.
Well, that precedes my experiences. My first conference was actually in 1978 in Rochester.
Yeah, this was, I think, after she had stopped doing that.
And not knowing what to expect at a conference. And I remember that there were 2 hotels where you could stay. And there was a very small concrete common area, like a lanai or something, that connected the two.
I think there was also a bridge across the river.
There
between-
was.
Yeah.
There was. And the opening reception, I believe, was held out in this little area. And I have no idea how many attendees there were, but it was tiny. And I don't know if it was because of the location or if it was something else. That was my first conference, and I have been to every conference since then. I get rather, I'll just say it, annoyed when colleagues say, oh, I'm not going to that conference. I don't like where it's being held.
Yeah.
And I always say, hey, my first conference was Rochester. There was nothing to do there. We've had conferences in a variety of cities where activities are not abundant, but we're not going for the city. I don't want this to sound like a, rah-rah
No, I hear
ALL
you.
conference.
I mean, we do
but
have a program for good reason.
Exactly.
And you have colleagues with whom you can meet and network.
Right,
And
right.
that's always been, in my sense, of what you go to annual meetings for.
I agree 100%.
And if the city is sort of interesting and you can find time,
then
go see
then
some
it's a
of it.
bonus.
Yeah.
To me,
or,
the city
or stay
where
over a little bit.
Exactly. To me, the city being a good, what I call go do something. You can
Yeah.
see something. Philadelphia, I think, is great for conferences because of that. But that's just a bonus
Yeah.
to me, and you're going for the conference. And I still feel that way as I get ready in a few months to go to my, I don't even know what number conference this is, but I really have not missed a conference since 1978, which is kind of scary when I think of it.
My first conference actually was here in Philadelphia, 1968. It was down by the area where the Liberty Bell and everything is now.
Okay. So it was just in a hotel that
It
was
was
down
in a
there.
hotel,
Right.
an old, older, I think it's now some sort of a retirement home
Okay.
or something of that sort.
I'm not sure what they would have used down there. There were
Yeah.
definitely hotels down there
Yeah,
that
there
are no
were-
longer
it
hotels.
was all in the hotel.
Right.
And
I was on my own ticket. I was a student still, finishing up. Actually, I finished up, but I hadn't started my first job. So I was on my own dime. And in those days, to get the best airfares, especially I flew from Seattle, so it was a bit of a distance.
Right.
I had to stay over a weekend.
Yes.
And as it timed out, I had several days at the end of this conference when I was still here. Most people had long since left.
Mm-hmm.
But we went over, a few of us were doing the same thing, and we went over, and it was the 4th of July weekend.
Great time to be here.
We were here, we were in bleachers in front of the, where the Liberty Bell is there, and the vice president, I think it was Humphrey, was vice president at the time, and he came to
Right.
speak. And I remember we were waiting for him to come, as you do, but they didn't have the security like they have today.
Right.
But they had a fair amount, and the motorcade came up beside the stands, and one of the motorcycle escorts flipped over. I don't know if he
Oh.
did something. Oh, we all jumped to attention, and everyone was wondering, well, what happened, and it turned out to be, fortunately, nothing serious. But
It's cobblestone streets. I know exactly. Usually they have them speak right in front of Independence Hall.
yeah, that's where he
And
was.
that is the original cobblestone streets of Philadelphia, so I can understand that it may be fine for a horse, but not for a motorcycle. So it doesn't surprise me
Yeah.
that that would have
Well,
happened.
it didn't have to come far because, I don't know, there was some sort of an after this speech reception, so he didn't leave right away.
Mhm.
And we were through because the speech was over, so
Right.
we were walking around, and I remember walking over towards the river, and there were the two Marine helicopters that they
Ah.
used to bring him in. And of course, I was in my mid-20s. I was intrigued by seeing all this stuff, and I had never lived in Washington, D.C. yet, so I didn't have any exposure to anything
Right,
like this.
right.
So
And
it
then
was
right
fine.
over the river, that particular river, and you look over, and that was where, that's Camden,
yeah, that's right. The Delaware River is
Right.
right there, and Camden's right across.
right across the way.
Yeah.
And it would have been the RCA building, at that time, RCA building, with the little nipper would have been looking back at you.
Oh, Nipper.
Oh, the
Now
memories
our
come flooding
current
back.
people will have never know this.
They
but
don't know what we're talking
RCA, the Radio Corporation of America,
Absolutely.
and I think the brand is still used by
It is.
somebody, or probably
It
somebody
is.
that lives in Japan or China.
Probably one of
own
those.
it at this point.
Mitsubishi or
but,
somebody.
They had an old-fashioned gramophone,
Mm-hmm.
and with a big speaker, one of those things that
Right.
actually didn't have amplification. It just was mechanical.
That was the amplification,
Yeah.
was that big cone.
Yeah, and this little dog sits in front listening to, as they used to say, his master's voice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was that was their trademark, and they had it up in the tower of the building.
Uh-huh.
It is now, I believe, condos, and they still have, I think, at least one window of the little nipper.
Well, they gotta have a little bit.
Yes. yes.
Out in Seattle, near where I live now, there used to be a brewery when I grew up, Six Rainier Brewery, and they had it's right off Interstate 5, the main north-south interstate through the city, and it's an old building. And for a while, one of the coffee companies had its headquarters there, and they had replaced an old letter R on the roof to identify Rainier for Rainier
Right.
beer with the letter for their name, and I'm not mentioning which one it is deliberately. No
I wonder,
plugs
let
on
me
that for
think.
me today. But now they've moved on, and that's been sold back for, I think, artists and so on are working in there, but they reinstated a version of that R.
Good for them.
It's
Good for them.
unfortunately the original is in the museum, and I remember the original, and this doesn't quite look as much. It's the wrong color.
Well, it was the thought that counts.
Yeah,
At least they
but
decided not
but
to
it's
do
back.
away with it completely.
Yeah, so it's back. So we have a little local history, like
Right.
Nipper is up here
Absolutely.
on this old RCA.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, why don't we've talked about your career, we've talked about Nipper and whatever else. Why don't we talk about some of the things you've done for the association? And let me sort of, I've already mentioned you've done a lot, more so than most, and that's for real. One of the things you and I worked together on, you did all the work, I don't know, the blame or the credit, I think it was credit because it was good, was some years ago when I was president of
Right.
ALL, you served as the program chair, which is a fairly significant undertaking. I had done it for Carolyn Ahern a
Right.
few years earlier. So I knew when I asked you that if you were smart, you'd say no way. But you said yes, as you often have on things for the profession. With that as sort of the introduction and the fact that you have a rather lengthy list from which to choose, would you like to talk a little bit about that aspect of your work?
Sure. I've had people say to me, why do you do all of this? You could just be a law librarian and go to meetings and go to annual conferences and not have meetings to go to and things. But this, when I was in college, it was the height of Vietnam War and all of that, and civil rights. And I always remembered the first time I ever saw it, it was the days of buttons, and people wore buttons.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an Eldridge Cleaver statement on a button that said, I hope I get this right, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought that was such a great statement. But to me, it didn't have to mean if you were part of the solution, and it didn't have to be that there was a problem and that you were part of the correcting something that was wrong, that it could just be part of the solution of moving forward, mm-hmm. or helping to change things. So in my mind, I blame that statement, because and it's not just with this association. If I'm involved in something, the art center that I'm involved with, it's like, does anything need to be done? How can I help with something? So my first conference, I said, was 78. Actually, was it 78 or 77? 78. I started here in 77. And I applied for a committee and got appointed to the Duplicates Exchange Committee, which does not exist anymore.
No, but it was
Thank
a big
goodness.
thing in that era.
It was,
Yeah.
and that was back in the days, all pre-computers, when we used to have to compile lists of the extra materials that libraries would send in on 3x5 cards, and then on legal-sized pieces of paper, people on the committee had to type up these lists. It was a horrible, I will admit, it was a horrible committee to be on, but it was my first committee.
A lot of work.
A lot of work. If you could stick through that, then you could do anything on a committee. And then they asked me the second year to chair it. And from then on, it was history. I just applied for committees, got involved with SISs. I chaired 3 SISs, which people told me I was crazy to do. But I wear, and I always have worn, more than one hat here. Mm-hmm. So it allowed me to be involved at different levels on different things. I think some of the highlights of what I've done, and this is not to slight any committee that I was on, but being on the executive board was, of course, great. I so enjoyed that.
Yeah.
I loved being your program chair. It was so much fun.
You were
Indianapolis.
So fun, easy to work with. Now, we had worked together on.
We had.
We actually were on the education committee earlier,
right?
And I think I was just coming on into the chair when I was
with
Carolyn Ahern,
yes.
So I became part of it when you were on it first.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew when I asked you that I knew somebody who really could do a super job.
Well, thank you. It was fun, and obviously it's the committee members that help with so many. I mean, so often it's a committee chair, an SIS chair that get the kudos, but obviously it's everybody that's worked with them.
Well, they're
so
not always all kudos. There's always a few
we won't
that
talk about those,
maybe don't see things quite the same way you hope they would.
Exactly. I chaired a lot of really fun committees, but I also developed a bit of a reputation of, if you want an ALL committee killed, ask me to chair it. The education committee, because actually you were chair of the education committee and annual program chair.
It was quite an undertaking.
It was, and that was the year that was the last year of the education committee as the education committee. Mm-hmm. So we did a lot of work and wrote up a lot of reports and gave a lot of information to the board, and the education committee went away that year. There was a PR advisory committee, and it was just when they were starting to do PR. Mm-hmm. And the year that I was chair of that disappeared because they asked, well, can your committee look at this and see if there's a better way to do it? And there were some other things. But to balance that killing of groups, I I don't believe in reinventing the wheel in anything that I do. So when I took over ILL, I wanted to know who my colleagues were. Excuse me, but pre-computer, that was difficult. So I started trying to figure out what group in AALL did this, and realized there really wasn't one that covered every group. The research and instructional RIPS, which I'm not remembering and I think it wasn't called RIPS at the time. They did it, but it was primarily academics in there. And because of the fee-based service, I also wanted to talk to law firm people to find out how we could serve their constituency.
Yeah.
So we formed this informal group, the document delivery, now they're caucuses, so it was the document delivery caucus. That still exists as an extremely informal group. Many years ago, even before that, on the chapter level, I was editor of our newsletter, wanted to talk to other chapter newsletter editors. Wasn't a way to find out what they were, wasn't a way to talk to them. So we started an informal group that I think still exists as the Council of Newsletter Editors. I
believe they do. I've
they
seen
still exist.
references
And I'm
to
not
it.
saying this for kudos for myself,
Yeah.
because again, there were many people that had to come together, agree to meet and do this, but
Sure.
I'm sort of saying it because I think that newer members, so many times newer members, well, how do you get involved? Well, and I always say to them, it's hard to get on a committee sometimes. There are so many people that want to be on committees. Start with SISs. Look around, see if there is a need. Start an informal group, and it can become a caucus, which can develop into more. So I often think to myself that newer members really need to think that they have to be part of that solution of, and not in a negative way, but the solution of moving AALL forward.
Yeah.
So it's really been good. I mean, so many people that you meet doing committee work, as you well know. I mean, that's how I met you.
Yeah.
But doing committee work is just, it's not only serving the profession, but I think you make lifelong friends.
You really do. And you mentioned that, if you can't get on a committee, and there are only so many slots,
Right.
and new people want to get involved, and that's reasonable, and what we did when we were there. Now you do have other avenues. One is join the special interest section if there is
Absolutely.
one that more or less covers that area of interest. There you don't have to be asked
No.
or appointed.
No.
You just become part of it. You go.
You find out what committees they have set up, you get involved in committees there,
Yeah.
and often that will pave your way to moving forward to do other things.
Yeah.
So and I know that Connell does a great job of giving all that information out to people, but I think that sometimes, especially now I look at the new people coming in and they look like babies, but the really new people coming in really need to have that stressed. I think that they need to get involved, not just for their own career to move forward, and I don't mean that they have to become someone that gets on the executive board for AAL, but I think you learn so much, and I think the key thing is networking, and now we can network all year long. It used to be, back in the old days, you would go to the annual meeting and you would see the friends that you saw once a year, unless you got on a plane and traveled someplace. But now, I'm not going to mention names, but there are so many colleagues that we're friends on Facebook. So I know what they're doing all year long. They know what I'm doing. You see them at the annual meeting, and it isn't, what have you done for the past year? It was, that was so great that you did such and such that I saw on Facebook.
Yeah.
So it really makes you feel not just like a colleague you see once a year, but a friend.
Mm-hmm. That's been one of the characteristics of this profession for me, is making friends. And
Yes.
now, even though I'm retired, I'm going out and talking to people just like you,
Mhm.
today's conversation, on camera for this project. And it's like, we've had lunch last week.
Right.
We pick it up so readily.
Exactly.
Today, you and I, others over the past, it's been a marvelous experience for me.
It has
I'm
been.
really enjoying this phase of my
Good.
life.
Good.
I'm in the
So are
Everyday
you on
Saturday
Facebook?
Club. No, I haven't
Now,
joined
see, if
it,
you
but I
if you
should.
get on Facebook, then you will see what your colleagues are doing during the year.
Yeah, maybe
And it's
I
not
should,
it's not
I should
spying.
probably.
It's
Actually, I've got a Facebook. account. I just have never publicized it. And
I
somebody
think that
found
it's
me on it
worthwhile.
one time. I should do that. You know, I when I got my first smartphone, there was an app for this. So
Right, exactly.
I loaded the app and then I set up the account, and I should probably take advantage of it.
You should take advantage of it and find my page and ask me to become a friend, and then
Yeah.
I'll know what you're doing
Then
and
you
you'll know
can
what I'm
decide
doing.
I'm going to insult the heck out of old
Right
Keel,
now, I
and I'll
know
just
so much
unfriend
about
him.
him that, absolutely.
I've heard from my own kids about some of that.
Yes, you have to be careful sometimes.
Yeah.
Now, years ago, you alluded to the fact that some of the colleagues look pretty youngish.
Yes.
When I first started in this field, I was, of course, a high school kid working for a week on a gig at the law library, throwing out books for the librarian. The dean at the time had been our next door neighbor, and he found 4 of us in the neighborhood. And he used to refer to the law students as the kids.
Right.
And I'd look at them, and boy, they look very old and mature to me.
Yes, it just depends. Things change.
Yeah. Well, I was around long enough so that they started to, in fact, look like kids. But the scary thing is that now they look like kids to my own kids.
Right. It just changes.
Yeah.
We're not getting older in the profession, but somehow there are younger people coming in, but we're not aging at all.
Yeah. Well, this sort of opens up the sort of the last topic that I wanted to raise, and that is when I have somebody who's been around the circuit like you have, and has pretty good ideas on what's going on with these new people coming in and all that. Do you have any thoughts or views about where our profession may be heading in the next few years?
I don't think there will ever be a time when law librarians are not needed.
Mm-hmm.
I have recently heard from colleagues, it was a law librarian, and they said that their school was worried because there was grumbling from the administration that, well, maybe we don't really need a library in the traditional sense. And I think that's true. I think libraries will not be the same as they always have been. But I don't think that there will ever be a time in my mind when law librarians are not needed. I don't think there will ever be a time that books as a print book will not be needed. When I started, since I've gone full circle on being collection development, everything, of course, was print. Lexis and Westlaw had just started, but nobody ever thought about canceling materials. Every library had every state reporter, every state administrative code, every state statute, multiple copies of the National Reporter System. I know that was true of your library.
Oh, heavens, yes.
Now it's difficult to find them in print if you need a print copy. I love PDFs. I think there's a little bit of danger in having our students use PDFs. I see it all the time with the journal editors, and I train them on how to find PDFs for their source hunts, but they never check to see if there's a print copy.
Oh,
They'll come up and say, I can't find this journal in Hein Online, and I look at the title, and it's like, well, did you check our online catalog? Well, no, I just went to Hein Online. Well, unfortunately, Hein Online is wonderful, but they don't have every journal.
yeah.
You need to check our journal. I know this is sitting up on the shelf. Or other titles that even from our main campus library. Well, it's not on JSTOR. Well, did you check their online catalog? No. So I think there's a little bit of a danger that we're promoting by telling people, check for PDFs, check for PDFs. So I think that books will always be here. Ebooks obviously are leaps and bounds, but speaking for our library, we're just starting to get into them. I've talked to colleagues around the country at other law libraries, and they also are just starting to, and I mean ebooks in the most traditional sense of an ebook, that it's on a platform, not a PDF of a book such as on Hein Online.
Yeah.
There is now competition for Lexis and Westlaw. I wouldn't be surprised if we see morphing and changing of those types of databases. There might be new databases added. It's difficult for me to say this is where I think it's going, and I think that might be partly because I actually never did reference in my entire career until about 2 years ago. I started doing regular reference stints. And I love doing it, but for me, I'm looking at the new technology as some of it's almost brand new to me because I haven't used it before. I think there will be more and more that will change. There are changes that I hope will come, but that's not exactly with the technology. And I'm not saying anything that our journals here at Penn don't know, but I would hope that the Blue Book changes so that they are not required to take originals anymore, because we all know that in many instances the author did not use a print copy of something. So it's my little plea that that in the future that will be a major change, because I think that that's one that has to change with the technology changes that we've seen.
There have been so many criticisms of that Blue Book,
Oh.
that citator over the years, and they ought to do this or that, but
Right.
they didn't
Right.
ever do. We'll see. What
We'll
happens.
see where that goes.
Yeah.
But being at one of the 4 schools that is a Blue Book school, we follow the Blue Book here, and and they know my thoughts on it, so I'm not saying anything on camera that they don't know. They know where I stand on the Blue Book, and I'm not saying it's a bad product or what they do is bad. I think that they're just not keeping up with technology.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they will, and I think that's part of what we as a profession need to help
I agree.
bring them along. I mean, I too hear in these conversations, because I ask some version of this question occasionally, and everybody pretty much I've asked thinks that the role that we play is evolving, and we need to help people be able to use and access
Right.
all this new stuff that comes to us through, digital technology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, since we are educating the lawyers, the future lawyers, I think we also need to be not more attuned to how lawyers are actually using the technology, but because I think most law schools are aware of that, but I think that as librarians, we may play the biggest role in introducing the students to some of the technology that will be used in the law firms. I wonder if I don't know of any law firms that still use the books for the majority of the major resources.
I would think the cost of rent in an office in
Absolutely.
a downtown setting especially would just absolutely make that something very
Right.
difficult to justify.
Not that they're getting Lexis and Westlaw and Bloomberg for free, but added up, that I think that's true. So I think that is a role that will evolve as attorneys start to practice law differently. That if law courses are not taught differently, because they still need to learn the basics of the law, but I think that's where the law librarians can play a role, working with their colleagues in the law firm settings and finding out how we can better educate the people before they hit the law firms.
Yeah. Well, I think on that we're sort of beginning to near the end of our conversation today, Merle, but is there, as is our custom, is there anything that we've not talked about that you would like to bring up?
I've probably talked about way more than we originally thought to talk about, but I think the last thing is just, and I'm going to try to say this without, it's not working, without getting choked up, but it is not working, so I may ask you to edit this. But
And I might forget to.
oh yes, I'm sure you will. But I think I already mentioned that it's a small community.
Yeah.
That's all I'll say. People can take from that what they want. No, seriously, I'll try to get through this. It's a small group, and you make friends.
Yeah.
That's it.
Well, you've talked about our colleague Liz Kelly, and she died very suddenly.
Right,
She
right.
was they were
And
at their
tragically.
lake home, and she went for a walk and
Right.
just didn't come
and
back.
did not come back.
And
And that could happen to anyone. I mean, someone
had
could get
never
hit by a
worked
bus
with
or
her,
something.
but when I heard about that, it affected me.
It, absolutely.
'Cause she was somebody I
Absolutely.
knew from years of
Right.
association involvement.
Right. So it is even though when I think now what my first conference was versus the conference in July, how many people will be there?
Mhm.
It has grown by leaps and bounds, but you still meet people. Although, as we were discussing at lunch, when I get the ballots now for AALL, I'm so happy to see new faces, but I look at these people and I go, okay, I have no idea who this person is. Which is good because it is showing that there's a next generation
Yeah.
of, well, in my case, probably two next generations of leaders coming forward.
Yeah.
And I think that says a lot about where the profession is going. I just hope that the new generations coming forward, even though the association is so large, that they find their own little niche of small community.
Well, they certainly can in many of these locations. We've already talked about the special interest
Right.
sections, chapters,
Mhm.
other local, sometimes sub-chapters, such as
Right,
here in
it's
Philadelphia, and other places, all sorts of ways to network. Even setting up a group of like colleagues for lunch. We used to do that in DC
Right,
with the
right.
academic. Well, we started off with the directors. There were about maybe 7 or 8 schools at the time, and in those days we didn't have that many librarians, so we added including the other librarians to these lunches, and we all got to know each other that way initially.
There's life outside of work.
Hmm. Well, this was, we counted it as work, at least I did.
Well, that's okay. I won't tell anybody.
Yeah, when I was sitting there drinking beer with my colleagues, it was work. but
It was
wasn't
work. And that's what I refer to as the networking. When you go out with friends and you always say, we're not going to discuss work. This is a purely social event, and you always wind up going back to, so did you buy this book? What are you doing with this database?
You get more done that way,
and
though,
you do.
which is very useful sometimes.
And then you remember who to call when you have a question about that.
Well, maybe on that, you've made the right point. Maybe on that, I should thank you, Merle Slyhoff, for talking with me today on camera. And I'm thanking you not just on my own behalf, but on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and Dick Spinelli, who are our colleagues with whom I have the honor of working to put together this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf section of Hein Online.
And it's been an honor, and I've been very honored that I was asked to participate, so thank you.
Well, we want to get good people, and you were selected because you fit that criteria to a T. Thank you, Merle.